Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to tackle a question you hear all the time, debated everywhere from classrooms to coffee shops. Is psychology actually a science?
And it's a totally fair question, right? Because when you think science, your mind probably jumps to chemistry labs, biology, things with beakers and formulas. Not so much talking about feelings. So how does psychology stack up against all that? Well, let's dig in and find out.
So here's how we're going to break it down. We'll start with what even makes something a science in the first place. Then, we'll look at the big three goals of any scientific pursuit. After that, we'll check out the actual tools psychologists use to do their research, see how they turn all that data into theories, and finally, we'll touch on the super important ethical rules they have to follow.
Okay, so first up, art or science? Before we can even start to judge psychology, we got to set some ground rules. What makes anything a science? What's the litmus test?
You have to remember, psychology is a huge field. You've got one person studying how crowds behave and someone else in a lab looking at a single brain cell. They seem like totally different worlds, right? But the one thing that connects every single one of them is their dedication to using scientific methods. That's the glue that holds the whole thing together.
Okay, so they're committed to science. But what does that really mean? Well, it all starts with these three big goals. Think of them as the blueprint for any scientific discovery.
It's kind of like being a detective, Your first job is just to describe what you see. What exactly is going on here? Then, once you see some patterns, you try to predict what's going to happen next. But the real payoff, the big aha moment, is when you can finally explain why it happened. That's the ultimate goal.
Okay, so let's put you to the test real quick. Have a look at this. The goals on the left are all jumbled up with the examples on the right. Go ahead and pause for a sec and see if you can match them up correctly.
All right, how did you do? So here are the right answers. See how describing is really just about defining what we're talking about? Simple enough. Predicting is all about looking ahead. If this, then what? An explanation, that's the deep dive. That's where we get into the why, linking something like aggression to a specific part of the brain.
So we've got the goals, but how do the psychologists actually go about achieving them? This is where their research toolkit comes in. They use what are called empirical methods, which is just a fancy way of saying they get their hands dirty collecting real-world data. This isn't just about sitting around and thinking up ideas. It's about going out and observing.
And this toolkit is packed with all sorts of different instruments. You've got naturalistic observations, surveys, case studies, the list goes on. The key is you don't use a hammer to turn a screw, right? The tool you pick depends completely on the question you're trying to answer.
Okay, let's take a funny example. Say you want to know if people really wash their hands after using a public restroom. You could survey them, sure, but what are they going to say? Of course I do. Naturalistic observation is where you just watch. And trust me, what people say and what they do can be two very different things. That's where you get the real, unfiltered truth.
Then you have something completely different, the case study. This is where researchers do a super deep dive on just one person or a small group. A really famous and frankly heartbreaking example is Jeannie. She was a young girl who was kept in isolation until she was 13. By studying her, we learned an incredible amount about how language develops. Now, you can't generalize from one person to the whole world, but the level of detail you get is just unmatched.
Now, what if you want to study how people change as they get older? You've got two main paths. You could do a longitudinal study, which means you follow the same group of people for years or even decades. Or if you don't have that kind of time, you can do a cross-sectional study. That's where you just compare different age groups, say 20-year-olds, 40-year-olds, and 60-year-olds all at the same time. Both are useful, but they answer slightly different questions.
Okay, so you've used your tools, you've gathered mountains of data. Now what? All that information is kind of useless if it's just a big pile of facts. The real magic happens next, connecting the dots and building a framework that actually makes sense of it all.
And that's where theories come into play. Now, we got to be really clear here. When a scientist says theory, they don't mean I have a guess. It's not a hunch. A scientific theory is a really powerful model. It's a whole system of ideas that explains why something happens and lets you make predictions you can actually go out and test.
And theories come in all shapes and sizes. You've got what are called grand theories. Think of someone like Freud, trying to explain literally everything about being human. They're fascinating, but super hard to prove or disprove. On the other hand, a lot of modern psychology is built on mini-theories. These are much more focused on a specific aspect of behavior, like how kids learn to share. They're smaller for sure, but they're the solid bricks we use to build our understanding.
Okay, this next part is absolutely crucial. When your subject is a living, breathing human being, the stakes are way higher than if you're studying, say, a rock. People have feelings, rights, and vulnerabilities. And because of that, there's a strict set of ethical rules, a moral compass, that every single researcher has to follow. No exceptions.
Which leads to this really tricky question. Is it ever okay for a researcher to lie to someone in their study? I mean, sometimes if you tell people exactly what you're looking for, it changes how they act, right? So, what's the right thing to do?
Well, to handle situations like that, there are some non-negotiable golden rules. First, there's informed consent. Basically, you have to tell people what they're getting into so they can make a real choice. And just as important is the right to withdraw. That means anyone can say, I'm out at any time, for any reason, and there's absolutely no penalty.
So back to that whole lying question. The short answer is sometimes. But, and this is a huge but, it's only okay if it's absolutely necessary for the experiment to work, if it won't cause any harm, and if you do something called a debriefing afterward. That's where you sit the person down and explain everything, what the study was really about and why you had to be a little sneaky.
All right, let's bring it all home. We asked at the beginning, is psychology a real science? Well, let's look at the evidence. It has clear goals: describe, predict, explain. It uses empirical, real-world methods to collect data. It builds testable theories from that data, and it follows a strict ethical code. So, what do you think? All signs point to a pretty solid yes.
So there you have it. Psychology definitely earns its science stripes. Which leaves us with one last big question to chew on. Now that we know just how powerful and rigorous this scientific toolkit is, what should we point it at next? What are the biggest, most important questions about ourselves that we need to start answering?